One day for God is over 1,000 years. It seems that the longevity of the patriarchs of the Old Testament were counted wrong. The calculations were tens of thousands of years and hundreds of thousands of years, and the genealogies of Adam, Seth, and Canaan and all these, Lamech and Methuselah, were hundreds of thousands of years. And there were 2 floods, 2 Noahs, 2 Lamechs, and the calculations were done in the wrong manner. This now proves that science and religion coincide. This is what everyone should know. The age of the human generation is 3 to 4 million years old, according to the Bible. According to the Bible and the early church fathers, Adam, and by extension the entire human race, was created by God 7,500 years ago. In fact, we are already a bit past them. 7,500 years corresponds to the year 1992 AD. In earlier times, this was accepted without objection. The problem with dating Adam arose in the 19th century when science discovered that the human race is older than the Old Testament states. But can the Holy Bible not tell the truth? The Bible is meant to tell the truth. However, this does not mean that it always reveals it directly and openly. It's often provided in disguise. The fathers of the early church take advantage of this tactic of the Bible in order to adapt its meanings to the perceptive capacity of the listeners. And that is why they adopt, for example, the dating of Adam as derived from the first reading of the Bible, literal interpretation. This dating was the only one suitable for earlier times. If the fathers of the church talked about millions of years, no one would believe them, and the credibility of the preaching of the gospel would also be degraded, since they would speak as the people of their time would have thought about unreal dates. How would people believe them about the rest of what they would say, that is, about the message of the gospel? Which message is more important than some numbers concerning insignificant for earlier times dates? However, these dates became more important in the modern era because they show that there is a disproportion between the Holy Bible and the latest scientific findings. The literal interpretation of the Bible today has the opposite effect than it did in the past. Instead of serving to keep the church from seemingly saying untrue things on dating matters, it has now come to be untrue. The old dating used by the fathers of the church as appropriate for their time is inappropriate for ours. However, there are some conditions for changing the biblical dating of Adam and the human race. First, we must show that the Old Testament does indeed provide an alternative dating to the classical and established one, and indeed that the alternative dating is compatible with that of science. Compatibility with science is not an end in itself, but it is certainly desirable, and this is the main subject of the article. Second, the alternative dating must have genuine Old Testament origins. We mean that we cannot begin to interpret the Bible as they please. Genuine Old Testament origins exist when the interpretation has the witness of God. That is, God witnesses that this particular interpretation for the dating we are interested in here has always existed in the Holy Bible, and it is just now the time has come for it to become more widely known. The interpretation we will give fulfills this condition because behind it, as we've already pointed out, is a person, the prophet that is, who wrote this, who receives divine revelations. Divine testimony does not necessarily imply a unique answer to the issue of dating. In a previous article, we spoke of a bundle of interpretations with regard to the interpretation of the Holy Bible in general. The bundle of interpretations is spiritual and does not coincide with the interpretation they claim, which is human. There are more than one versions. The matter is not yet closed, neither for science nor for theology. God, through the Bible, seems to participate in our research. Of course, he knows the real answer, but what would be the point of telling us from the chair? In addition, the answer or answers are appropriate for today's times. At a future time, the new answer may be added. Thirdly, the church, we are referring to the Christian Orthodox Church as clergy and people, should be informed in the sense of divine information, hence from God, that the previous condition is indeed fulfilled, the second condition. This is something that will be done in the future. The way in which the teachings appropriate for each age are integrated to the church is expressed in a passage from the book of Saint Sophronius Sakharov, Setuala Seluanos the Athonite, Holy Monastery, the Holy Forerunner of Essex, England, 7th edition, 1995, page 110 to 111. Each new book having the right to be included in the teaching of the church or to express it is subject to the judgment of the church. She slowly but thoroughly investigates and tests everything from all sides, and above all from the side of the influence of teaching on life. This criterion in terms of the effect of teaching on life has a very serious importance because of the inextricable bond of doctrinal consciousness and spiritual life. Thus, it rejects everything that proves contradictory or does not agree with the spirit of the Christ-like love for which the Church lives. It should be noted that the criterion of the effect of teaching on life mentioned by Saint Sophronius has value even for matters of dating, because these also touch even slightly on issues of a doctrinal order, which in their turn, at least and somewhat subconsciously, they influence the life of Christians due to the inextricable bond of doctrinal consciousness and spiritual life. Before proceeding, we'd like to remind you that in modern science it's known and taken for granted that humans, Homo sapiens, have been living on our planet for millions of years. For example, Wikipedia's Paleolithic period entry states, "The Paleolithic period is defined as the earliest part of the Stone Age, during which man used stone tools and extended over a long period beginning 2.5 million years, approximately to 10,000 BC. Elder Ambrosius Lazarus, 1912 to 2006, seems to agree with the dating of science when he says, "Unfortunately, humans looked to the earth to conquer. Millions of years passed and no one conquered the earth. All came, passed, and left the earth to the earth." Now thus the question arises, does the Holy Bible contain dates of the order of millions of years? It may seem unbelievable, but the answer is yes, it's positive. As is well known, the Bible mentions unusually long lifespans for the first humans to live on earth. Adam lived 930 years, Seth 912 years, Enos 905 years, etc. We respectively verses 5, 8, 10, etc. Verses without further reference will be referred to the 5th chapter of Genesis, but let us examine what exactly the biblical text says. For Adam, the biblical text says the following, "And all the days of Adam were fulfilled, let him live 30 and 900 years, and he died," verse 5. We notice an unusual inversion of the usual writing of numbers. Instead of 930, it says 30 and 900 years. Does this reversal in the order of numbers contain information that the Bible wanted to remain hidden for thousands of years from the people of ancient times to be revealed in our time? We usually put the big number first and then the smaller numbers. One might say that this is how the Old Testament generally gives the numbers. Yes, but not always. Sometimes it puts the numbers in their correct order. Throughout the genealogical list of chapter 5, it gives the numbers in reverse order. There is one exception, to Enos up to Lamech. And Lamech lived 880 and 100 years and begat a son, verse 28. But then the sequence of the numbers becomes regular, because it says, "And Lamech lived after he begot this Noah 565 years, verse 30. And all the days of Lamech were 753 years, and he died, verse 31. What does this mean? It means that the Bible purposely reverses the order of the numbers because it has a reason to do so. And when the reason disappears, it restores the correct order of the numbers. What kind of information would the Bible want to convey to us in this encrypted way, quote unquote? The Bible itself tells us so indirectly in verse 5, "And all the days of Adam let him live were 30 and 900 years. We see what the cipher is, all the days, 30. That is, Adam lived 30 days. In the interpretive version we are considering, 900 years are added to them. It certainly makes no sense to add 30 days to 900 years. But we said that we usually put the big numbers first and then the small ones. Does the 30 days represent a period of time longer than 900 years? Do we have biblical evidence for such a thing? Of course, explicit and specific. In the second epistle of the Apostle Paul, chapter 3, verse 8, the apostle writes, "Nevertheless, I do not mislead you, beloved, that one day is to the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day." See also Psalm 89, verse 4. What the Apostle Peter writes, in essence, repeating a psalm verse, is not only a different perception of time, it proves a key factor, a factor of proportion, that the day should be taken as 1,000 years. Where? Where needed. In this case, the genealogies of Genesis. Therefore, Adam lived not 30 days and 900 years, but 30,000 years and 900 years. The small number is not 30, but 900. And what did we achieve with it? We have increased Adam's unusually long age of 930 years to thousands of years. If 930 years seems unreal, who would believe that Adam lived 30,000 years plus 900 years? It is, however, clear that the different interpretation of the number 30 and 900 years also requires a different interpretation of the word Adam. This is astonishing, isn't it? Before we continue, let's give, so that we can easily refer to it, a name for this different interpretation of numbers. Let's call it a modern interpretation of the genealogical numbers of Genesis chapter 5. We will also use it in the genealogy of 11th chapter of Genesis. We call it modern interpretation because it is suitable for modern times. If then we give the modern interpretation to the numbers of the genealogy, what is the new meaning acquired by the word Adam? Obviously, we will not understand Adam in the modern interpretation as an individual person, but as a set of successive generations. That is to say that he expresses an entire genealogy. For ease of reference, we will call this genealogy Homo Adam. Homo Adam therefore lived 30,900 years. The modern interpretation does not abrogate the classical, literal interpretation of 930 years. Adam, that is, the first man who lived on earth, did indeed live 930 years. Actually, this is about the time period of Adam's life after his fall. Before the fall, it makes no sense, although it is possible, to count the years, because the reception of time on the part of the prophetic Adam was different. For the Adam's life before the fall, see article, the Paradise of Eden was in Pangea, that's when all the continents were Pangea, all together. The literal interpretation of the number 30 and 900 years and the word Adam is not abolished. An additional interpretation is simply added. The modern interpretation applies to all the genealogical numbers of chapter 5, provided they are written in reverse order. The hundreds are written at the end instead of the beginning. We don't need to look everywhere for the expression the days to understand that thousands of years are hidden behind the inverted numbers. The same applies with the case that the expression the days is written in the biblical verse, but it's not the appropriate position. The biblical text is not a scientific text. It gives at some point indication of how the modern interpretation will be made, and leaves the reader to understand that this interpretation has a more general application. And this, however, does not mean that this interpretation is valid in other chapters of Genesis, except for the genealogical list of the 11th chapter, which is the continuation of the genealogical list of the 5th chapter, or in other books of the Old Testament where there is also a reversal of sequence of numbers. No doubt there will be some reason for the reversal there too, but its meaning will be different. So when the Bible says Adam lived 3,200 years, and begat according to his idea and after his image, and called his name Seth, verse 3, we should understand that in the context of the modern interpretation, the 30 here also refers to 30,000 years, even if the expression a days is absent. In the next verse 4, and the days of Adam were fulfilled, let this Seth live after he was born 700 years. Although the days are mentioned, but there is no inverted sequence of numbers since it only gives hundreds of years, so it's not put question of invoking thousands of years. And note here that the genealogy of chapter 5 gives 3 numbers for each patriarch: how long he lived before the birth of his most important son, how long he lived after the birth of his most important son, and how long he lived in total. The 3rd number is equal to the sum of the first 2. To find the contribution of the genealogy of the 5th chapter to the age of the human race, we need only the years that each forefather patriarch lived until the birth of his son. The other 2 dates, how long he lived after the birth of his son and how long he lived in total, are not needed, but we are interested in seeing if the summation is correct. In the literal interpretation, the sum always comes out correct, but we want to verify that it also comes out correct in the context of the modern interpretation, where the numbers change relative to the literal interpretation. Going back to Adam, if we add the first 2 numbers, Adam's lifetime before the birth of Seth, verse 3, plus Adam's lifetime after the birth of Seth, verse 4, we will arrive at the correct sum, the total life of Adam, verse 5. In the context of the modern interpretation of numbers, we have 30,000 plus 200 plus 700 equals 30,900 years. Is that the total lifetime of Adam? Yes, luckily it is, according to the biblical text. All the days of Adam were fulfilled, let him live 30 and 900 years, and he lived, and he died, verse 5. 30 is interpreted in modern interpretation as 30,000. Plus 900 years, we have a total of the requested 30,900 years. What was said of Adam is also true of the other forefathers in the genealogy of Genesis 5. We will also use the term homo for them when I apply with the modern interpretation the numbers. Therefore, in the context of the modern interpretation, Homo Seth lived 5,200 years, and Seth lived 5 and 200 years and begot Enos, verse 6. As the reader may ascertain by looking in the Old Testament, the addition of which we speak before is essentially verified in Homo Seth. The next patriarch, Enos, is the only one who does not have a contribution of thousands of years until the birth of his son, and Enos lived 190 years and begat Canaan, verse 9. Verifying the summation in his case takes a bit of analysis. The biblical text says, and Enos lived after he begot this Canaan 15 years and 700, verse 10. And all the days of Enos were 5 years and 900, and he died, verse 11. In verse 11, 5 years is understood as 5,000, since verse 9 has no thousands. For the sum to be correct, the number 5 must also be mentioned in verse 10, and indeed before any other number, so that it can be given the value of thousands of years. This is ensured by the mysterious writing of the number 15 in the form 15. In the literal interpretation, it is, of course, the simple 15. In the modern interpretation, 15 should be read as 5 and 10. This is how we understand why the biblical text gives the unorthodox writing 15. Indeed, the 5 will give 5,000 years, while the 10 will add to the 700 years of verse 10 and give 710 years. The 710 years, if added to the 190 of verse 9, gives 900 years of verse 11. Thus, the addition is verified. Let it be noted that the Holy Bible does not ignore the word 15. In the book of Exodus, chapter 27, it writes, and the second floor 15 cubits, verse 18. And if someone wants to say that it is a different book of the Bible in which the way in which the number 15 is expressed is different, we point to the immediately preceding verse 14, where the number is found in the form 15, and 15 cubits, the height of the sails, reverse here is unknown to us. The next forefather, Canaan, has a contribution as Homo Canaan to the age of the human race. We will see below that there is a modification, originally 70,100 years, and Canaan lived 70 and 100 years and begat Malaleel, verse 12, where 70 denotes 70,000 in modern interpretation. The question of summation in his case is somewhat complicated. Before we break it down, let's note the following. All the summations concerning the forefathers of the chapter 5 genealogy are trivial, similar to the summation on Adam, except Canaan and Lamech. Enos required some explanation, but it was simple. If the summation fails within the context of the modern interpretation to even one progenitor, then the modern interpretation is rejected. It cannot be accepted. However, the Holy Bible seems to warn us with simple decipherment 2 or 3 verses before the beginning of the 5th chapter, specifically in the 24th verse of the 4th chapter, that we will encounter some problems in the context of the modern interpretation. In Canaan and Lamech, that 7 was descended from Cain, and from Lamech 7 septuagenarians. The Bible seems to know that we will have trouble in these 2 forefathers. That is why it warned us that at the same time it gives us, through this warning, the appropriate keys. The slight difference in the name Cain and Canaan is what will give us the solution to this case. The solution we will give will strengthen our confidence in the modern interpretation, that is, that its author, who is, through Moses, God himself, had this in mind. Let it be noted that, by the way, we say we do not abolish a literal interpretation of verse 24 of the 4th chapter. We simply distinguish an additional interpretation in this verse. Let's show then that the summation in Canaan is achievable within the modern interpretation. We will use the child logic that we have often used in previous articles on the prophet. First of all, let's see where the issue lies. The biblical text is as follows. And Canaan lived 70 and 100 years and begat Malaleel, verse 12. And Canaan lived after he begat this Malaleel 700 years, verse 13. And all Canaan's days were 10 years and 900, and he died, verse 14. If we do, in the context of modern interpretation, the sum of 70,000 years, verse 12, plus 40,000 years, verse 13, we beget 110,000 years and not 10,000 years, that verse 14 predicts. And as we mentioned above, in the summation we should incorporate the last 2 letters of Canaan's name, provided, however, that the name and therefore its last 2 letters are immediately before the numbers so that they justify somehow to be cut off from name and participant in the summation. This condition applies to verse 12 and verse 14, not verse 13. A originally has the value of the unit, while an n expresses 50, based on the Greek numbering. However, because A is before n, we will consider it to have a value that exceeds n. This is the logic that runs through the analysis we do, as we'll see below. That is, A should express hundreds, since n expresses tens, 50. So A equals 100 since it has a value of unity in the first place. Now adding n, 50, refers to 50,000 years, to 70. 70 referring to 70,000 years, and A, which here has a value of 100, to the hundreds of verse 12, we get 50 plus 70 equals 120, referring to 120,000 years as the sum of 50 plus 70,000. And 100 plus 100 equals 200 years. The grouping, hence what will be added to what is not determined in advance, so we choose it freely so that the request we want arises. Adding n equals 50, which refers to 50,000 years, and A, which we said here has a value of 100, but since it is a part of the sum of tens, we will not manage it as 100, but with the way we handle tens, that is, we give it the context of modern interpretation. A final value multiplying by 1,000 equals 100,000 in 10 of verse 14. the 10 refers to 10,000 years, we get 50 plus 100 plus 10 equals 160, hence 160,000 years, as the sum of 50,000, 100,000, and 10,000 years. Therefore, 120,000 years, verse 12, plus 40,000 years, verse 13, gives the 160,000 years of verse 14. As for the hundreds, 200 verse 12 plus 700 verse 13 gives the 900 years of verse 14, so the sum is correct. Since the process of the proof we have changed the 70 of verse 12 by adding n 50, the question arises as to what number we shall consider for the contribution to the age of the human race. The 70, hence 70,000 years, or the sum of 70 plus 50 equals 120,000 years. Both options seem acceptable. The difference is small, 50,000 years, compared to the millions we will arrive to at as the age of the human race, but the same issue will be raised with Lamech, where the difference, as we shall see, is considerably greater. We will choose 120,000 years for Canaan. The same choice will be made for Lamech, leaving it to the reader to see what numbers come up in the other version. Let's now turn to the next forefather, Malaleel. The biblical text says, "And Malaleel lived 65 and 100 years, and begat Jared," verse 15. 3 numbers appear here instead of 2. The order is reversed. If we interpret 60 as 60,000, this is the only possibility if we assign to 5 the value of 5,000, then 60 cannot receive an acceptable value since it must be less than thousands and greater of hundreds. Then the preceding 5 should denote an even greater number. It will not state either 5,000 or 50,000. It should state 500,000 years. Therefore, Homo Malaleel has a contribution to the age of the human race of 560,000 years. We ignore the hundreds because they are negligible. The next 3 instances of ancestors are similar to that of Malaleel. It is about Jared. And Jared lived 62 years and 100 and begat Enoch, verse 18. Enoch lived 65 and 100 years and begat Methuselah, verse 21. Methuselah lived 7 years and 61 and begat Lamech, verse 25. So Homo Jared has a contribution to the age of the human race of 260,000 years, Homo Enoch 560,000 years, Homo Methuselah 760,000 years. Next comes Lamech. He will discipline us more, 77 instead of 7. Then Canaan, as the verse we mentioned above warns that 7 are descendants from Cain, and for Lamech 7. Lamech lived 80 and 100 years until he gave birth to his son Noah, Genesis 5:28. The 80 and 100 years is the first addition to Lamech's sum, that is, the sum of years he lived before the birth of his son, and the years he lived after the birth of his son. They correspond to 800,000 and 80,000 and 100 years. After the birth of his son, Lamech lived 565 years, Genesis 5:30. 565 years is the second addition to Lamech's sum. Unlike other numbers in the genealogy of chapter 5, here the numbers are given in the correct order. Hence, first the hundreds, then the tens, then the ones. The modern interpretation cannot be applied since the tens are in their proper place after the hundreds and not before them. For the same reason, we cannot put hundreds of thousands in units. The total number of years that Lamech lived is 753 years, Genesis 5:31, which is the sum, hence the result of adding the first addendum to the second addendum. The numbers of the sum are given in the correct order, so the modern interpretation again cannot be applied. Therefore, there is a problem in the summation because in the first additive, there are hundreds of thousands and tens of thousands that do not appear in the summation. The solution will be given by certain letters of the word Lamech. The general reasoning will we applied to Canaan applies. In Canaan's case, we remove the last two letters, A and N, to ensure the requested equality of and explained why. In Lamech's case, there is no such limitation. We can take as many letters of his name as we need, as long as they form a single group without spaces. That is, the word Lamech is broken into two parts, of which the left part, has no participation in the addition. Only the second part of the word Lamech, participates in the addition. For the requested correction of the sum in Lamech, we get the letters A, M, E, X. We get the same letters in the first addendum of the sum Lamech, and we'll see the numerical value of alpha, mi, epsilon below in the Greek letters. We take the numerical value of the letter X equals to 600 and add it to both the first additive and the sum so that the sum is not affected. There is no correction other than adding 600. In the first additive, we have a quantity of 880,000. This quantity is missing from the sum. The letters alpha, mi, epsilon, which we will add to the sum if we take them as alpha equals 1 or 1,000, mi equals 40 or 40,000, epsilon 5 or 5,000. Added together will not give us the requested huge figure of 880,000, but they precede x, he, which is 600, and therefore we are entitled to consider. Without it being mandatory, we will use the other version of the first addendum. According to the logic we have used, that these are thousands, not the known ones of Greek numbering, 1,000, 40,000, and 5,000. But those that arise based on the rules we saw in the fourth patriarchs that precede Lamech, what did we see there? That the units expressed hundreds of thousands, while the tenths have as a unit measurement the thousand. So alpha equals 100,000, mi equals 40,000. Here by coincidence there is an identification with Greek numbering. Epsilon 500,000. The sum of alpha, mi, and epsilon is 640,000. That is not the point of 880,000, but in the present analysis, which is done on behalf of the prophesied, we are entitled to use codes of the prophesied. A code par excellence is 64, corresponding to the first martyrdom, which is a square of 8 times 8 equals 64. We have seen a double 555 on a draconian date, 5/5/2024, which reminds us of the perfect squares. See article year 2020, one of the most powerful of all centuries, what the prophetic date 55 says. Now, according to Leo the Wise and Elder Ambrosius. Similarly, 88 of 880,000 refers to a perfect square, 8 squared. So we see that there is a connection between 640,000 and 880,000, connection related to the first martyrdom of the prophet. If therefore 88 or 880,000 be replaced by 64, that is 8 squared, we shall obtain in the first addendum, instead of 880,000, the number of 640,000, so that the equality is verified, at least as regards to the thousands. We remind you that we are doing throughout this article is decryption, the rules of which we discovered along the way. Replacing 88 with 64 does not follow from the math. It's another type of rule, like a game, related to the prophet. If we take this correction into account for the calculation of the age of the human race, we then have a reduction of 240,000 years. 880,000 minus 640,000 equals 240,000, because instead of 880,000 that we would get for the contribution of Lamech, we of course mean Homo Lamech. We will have a contribution of only 640,000 years. We are now left with the small numbers, the hundreds, tenths, and units. We'd like to add to the first addendum using the letters alpha, mi, and epsilon, not the letter he, x, the quantity 88, so that the 100 years appearing in the first addendum change to 188. So when added to 565 years of the second addendum, to take the 753 years that the Bible mentions as the sum, and to verify the sum. The same letters, alpha, mi, epsilon, alpha equals 1, mi equals 40, and epsilon equals 5 do not add up to 88, as we would like. An alternative solution would be if they gave the sum 64, because of the connection of 88 with the 64 we exploited earlier. So if we ended up with 64, we would convert it to the acquired 88, but the letters alpha, mi, epsilon alone do not give either 64. More reasoning is needed with the childish logic we use. A transformation that we are entitled to do with the help of Trahony's revelations is to replace epsilon with 5, theta with 9, and as we wrote in a previous article, in the place of theta we can put epsilon. Of course, the reverse also applies. Now, not even with the transformation is a desired 88 or 64 achieved, but we notice that the two letters mi and epsilon, the letter epsilon is taken transformed, gives a code of the prophesied 49. It's the code of the second martyrdom. This satisfied us because we have already used the code for the first martyrdom, and now we see the code of other martyrdom also appearing. Our interest is multiplied by the finding that the code of the second martyrdom, written in slightly different form, is mentioned in the book of Genesis in the verse to which we have already referred, that 7 were issued from Cain and from Lamech 77. Here we are, of course, interested in Lamech, that the 77, that is 70 times 7, which equals 490, the first part of the verse we used in the patriarch Canaan. Now it's time to use the reverse of the rest of the verse, which gives 10 times 490 equals 49 times 10. The code of the second martyrdom, 49. It's clear that the Bible wants to connect the deciphering of the true age of the human race with the prophesied. How will the new key for decryption, which the Holy Bible gives us at this point, be used? How then will we utilize this concept of tenfold? 490 equals 49 times 10. 490 itself does not help us to arrive at the required 88 or 64. From the three letters alpha, mi, epsilon, the two letters mi and epsilon, the letters E transformed give us 49, and we're left with one more letter, the letter alpha. So this is what needs to be increased tenfold, and it gives 10. Since alpha equals 1, and we will have 1 times 10 equals 10. Adding together, we get alpha plus mu plus epsilon equals 10 plus 49 equals 59. 59, although it's not equal to the required number 88 or 64, is a welcome number because it's identical to the representation of Trahonis. I'm not going to go into this is too much, of course. But I'll go a little bit later. Okay, we have completed the case of Lamech, from which we get the 640-year contribution, 640,000-year contribution to the age of the human race, ignoring the smaller numbers, which are of value in verifying the sum, as a negligible contribution to the age of the human race. At this point, we can calculate the contribution of genealogy of the 5th chapter to the age of the human race, ignoring the small numbers, hence hundreds or even smaller numbers we have. Adam, 30,000 years, plus Seth, 5,000, ignoring the 100 years of Enos, plus 120,000 Canaan, plus 560,000 Malaleel, plus 260,000 Jared, plus 560,000 Enoch, and plus 760,000 Methuselah, plus 640,000 Lamech equals 2,935,000 years. This is the genealogy contribution of chapter 5. As we have already pointed out, the modern interpretation does not do away with the literal interpretation. Adam as a specific person, individual, is the first member of Homo Adam that lived, even if it seems like a long time, 930 years. Seth as a person is the next number in his lineage. Homo Adam lived and lived 912 years. The same applies to the other ancestors of chapter 5. Whatever has been said by the fathers of the church about these forefathers still in general valid. The main difference is that they lived millions of years before today and not just a few thousand years ago. However, the chain of succession in the literal interpretation will have to be opened somewhere in order to fit the numerous generations of the homos of the 5th chapter, of Homo Adam and Homo Lamech, and that are interposed. This opening appears to Lamech, for there we observe the restoration of the reverse order of the numbers to normal order, and knowing what in the modern interpretation the reverse order of the numbers means, that is to say that they express very large numbers, thousands of years. The case of Lamech seems like a return from the high flights of the very large numbers of the ordinary numbers of the little interpretation. Therefore, Adam, Seth, etc., up to Methuselah, as specific persons, lived in the beginning of the genealogy of Homo Adam, while Lamech, as a specific person, is the last member of the genealogy of Homo Lamech. Between Methuselah and Lamech is interposed the rest of the genealogy unknown to us of the Homo Adam, as well as the genealogies of the rest of the biblical homos of the 5th chapter. In addition, we consider that Methuselah has a son named Lamech, the first Lamech, so the other Lamech, hence the last member of the Homo Lamech lineage, is the second Lamech. Both Lamech had a son, Noah. The first Lamech had a son, the first Noah, and the second Lamech had a son, the second Noah. Because as we have written, there were 2 Noahs and 2 floods. See the article, The Sources of Pentateuch and the Theopneustai. Of the facts of the Bible mentioning about Noah, some apply to the first Noah, some to the second Noah, and some to both. Descendants of the second Noah are recorded in the genealogy chapter 11 of Genesis. The question arises as to how much this genealogy contributes to the age of the human race. According to one verse, the genealogy of chapter 11 can be taken purely literally. We say exclusively because the modern interpretation does not displace the literal interpretations but coexist with it. So if the modern interpretation is not applied to the genealogy chapter 11, then its literal version goes as a contribution just over 1,000 years. That is completely negligible compared to the millions of years of the genealogy of the 5th chapter. This version is legitimate, but we will not adopt to it. It remains then to consider the application of the modern interpretation of the genealogy of the 11th chapter. At first we find the genealogy of chapter 11, there are following differences in relation to that of chapter 5. A, there is no reversal of numbers. Numbers are given in their normal form and hundreds, tens, and units. However, there is one exception to the patriarch Phaleg. The numbers are given in reverse order. B, the 3 numbers are not given for each patriarch, but only 2. How long he lived before and how long after the birth of his most important son. The sum is not given, so it cannot be verified. Also, the genealogy of chapter 11 is the following peculiarity. In most patriarchs, the number of years they lived until the birth of their son is 130 years, or a few units more. And before we go on, we'll go back a bit to Seth in chapter 5. There we had assigned the units to thousands. We refer to the units preceding the hundreds. But when we examine the patriarch Melaleel and the patriarchs who followed him, we see that the units which precede the tens and hundreds must be attributed to hundreds of thousands. This is due to the presence of tens which are absent in Seth. That is, we have implicitly adopted the rule that when there is an inverted series of numbers, the units express thousands of the tens if the tens are absent. Well, if the tens are present, the units express hundreds of thousands. Can you imagine? But should we go back to Seth and correct what we said there, changing the thousands to hundreds of thousands? So we would adopt the simplest rule that when we see units in reverse order, we will always assign them the values of hundreds of thousands in the context of genealogies we are considering. The latter version is certainly legitimate, and we could adopt it, provided we take the genealogy of chapter 11 entirely literally, which we will not. Without this condition, that is, if we apply the modern interpretation to this genealogy, the simplest rule that the units in reverse order are always worth hundreds of thousands will lead us to a dead end, as we'll see. Let us now come to Phaleg in the genealogy of chapter 11, Peleg, who lived 30 and 100 years, verse 18, until the birth of his son, and 9 and 200 years, verse 19, after his birth. And here we have the only case of reverse order of the numbers. The hundreds are written after the tens or units, and the modern interpretation Peleg lived, not of course as an individual, but as a whole lineage, which we will call Homo Peleg. 30,000 and 100,000 until the birth of his most important son. After his birth, he lived according to the 900 and 200 years, the 9 and 200 years. Modern interpretation, either 9,000 or 200 years or 900,000 and 200 years. 900,000 years follow the simplest rule seen earlier, that units in reverse order always have a value of hundreds and thousands from reception, which, as we said, will lead us to a dead end. Abraham was born according to the data of the 11th chapter in the literal version, 511 years after the birth of the son of Peleg. The 511 years is the sum of 132 years of verse 20, plus 130 years of verse 22, plus the 179 years of verse 24, plus the 70 years of verse 26. Since Abraham lived roughly 2,000 years before Christ, we conclude that Peleg, we refer from Homo Peleg, has not yet died out, since his 9,000 or 900,000 years of life after the birth of his son have not yet passed. Only half of the 9,000 years have passed. So we ended up with the absurdity of the Holy Bible writing that Peleg as a set of generations, hence as Homo Peleg, died, while the calculations we made show that he still has many years left to live. Of course, there is a solution. The Bible wants to give us a new key to decipher the 11th chapter. The years of life of the patriarchs who lived 130 years or a few units more until the birth of their son must introduce some exception to the general rule that when the sequence of numbers is the regular one, then the number of years they give is taken literally. The rule applies both to the literal interpretation and to modern interpretation. Thus, especially and only in the numbers of 130 or a few units more, the years they refer to should not be taken literally, but as much longer periods of time in the context of modern interpretation. How much longer we will examine below. After Peleg and the patriarch Ragau, who lived 132 years until the birth of his son, verse 20, and Serug, who lived 130 years until the birth of his son, verse 22. Next is the patriarch Nahor, who lived 179 years until the birth of his son, verse 24. Let us recall at this point that only the years of life until the birth of the next patriarch contribute to the age of the human race. The years that each patriarch lived after the birth of his son have no contribution and are therefore no interest until they cause a problem that the patriarch is not yet dead. The lifetime of the patriarchs Ragau and Serug spans, as we shall see, a period of many thousands of years, and therefore covers each an entire genealogy, which we will call respectively Homo Ragau and Homo Serug. Conversely, the patriarch Nahor, who does not belong to the cycle of life years until the birth of the son of 130 years old, or a few units more, he breaks this cycle, having lived 179 years until the birth of his son, and should be taken as a single person. In Nahor, the encrypted genealogies of thousands of years hidden behind the names of certain patriarchs stop. That Ragau and Serug and the previous before Peleg patriarchs who lived 130,000 years, or a few units more until the birth of their son, correspond in modern interpretation to entire genealogies of thousands of years, does not mean that there are not and their respective patriarchs as individual persons. However, they will not concern us here. We now proceed to calculate the time period corresponding to 130 years or a few units more. 132 years Patriarch Ragaus, 134 for the Patriarch Ever, and 135 Patriarch Arphaxad. In the genealogy of the 5th chapter, we had considered that tens of thousands, that is, we'd multiply them by a factor of 1,000. The units, when they precede the hundreds, we have multiplied them again by a factor of 1,000, while when they precede the tens, we have multiplied them by a factor of 100,000. What is a factor by which we must multiply 130 years? We'll have a try. And we're asked to, what we're asking is that the two patriarchs, Ragau and Serug, taken as genealogy as Homo Ragau and Homo Serug, lived until the birth of their son, whatever that means. Note that the phrase until the birth of their son will be implied hereafter without mentioning it. Although both of them together more than 9,000 or 900,000 years, so as to ensure that Peleg as a genealogy is extinct. So if the coefficient is 10, then Ragau lived 1,320 years, Saruk at 1,300. The sum of 1,320 plus 1,300 is 2,620 years is sufficient to cover both 9,900 years. If the coefficient is 100, then Ragu lived 13,200 years, Saruk lived 13,000 years. The sum of 13,200 and 13,000, 26,200 years, is insufficient to cover 900,000 years, but sufficient to cover 9,000. If the coefficient is 1,000, then Ragu lived 132,000 years and Saruk 130,000 years. The sum of 132,000 plus 130,000 is 262,000 years. Again, insufficient to cover 900,000 years, but sufficient to cover 9,000. And if the coefficient is 10,000, then the total is 2,620,000 years. This time is sufficient to cover not only 9,000 years, but also 900,000. So that's the way it goes. And if we consider all the patriarchs who lived 130 years or a few units more until the birth of their son and use the previous coefficient of 10,000, then the sum, Arksafad, Kenan, Salah, Ever, Ragav, and Surak, equals to 7,910,000 years. If we add 30,000 years to Peleg, we get 7,940,000 years, and this contribution to the age of human race, we have not taken into account some numbers of years with negligible contribution is too great. So with a choice of 9,000 years, acceptable factors we saw above are the factor 100 and the factor 1,000. And the contribution of the 11th chapter to the age of human race is for the factor of 100. And we end up, so based on Holy Scripture, at two options. For the age of humankind after the fall of Adam, 3,050,000 years or 3,750,000 years. 3,050,000 years is the age of human race is compatible with the Homo that science has discovered. At this point, we quote a piece from a news of the year 2015. Paleologists have discovered a mandible in Ethiopia that dates back 2.8 million years and is believed to be the oldest known fossil of a modern human ancestor. It's probably a remnant of the oldest member of the human family, Homo, ever found. And the find is at least 400,000 years older than when scientists previously thought that the first Homo appeared. Previously, the oldest human fossil was 2.35 million year old upper jaw, also found in the Afar region of Ethiopia and East Africa, considering the most likely birthplace of humanity. And this is Sky News Environment, and I've translated this for you from a Greek article. However, it says we will prefer the other version of 750,000 years. The reason is that 3.3 million year old tools have been found, while there are also indications of 3,400,000 year old tools use. See BBC News, oldest stone tools predate earliest humans, 20th of May 2015. The world's oldest stone tools have been discovered, scientists report. They date to 3.3 million years ago. Although science does not attribute the manufacture of these tools to Homo, we consider it to be evidence of human presence. And this is from Dimitri A. Isn't this fascinating? So it shows that the way the years of the patriarchs were counted was wrong. They had a different way of counting it, giving the hundreds and hundreds of thousands valuation depending on where the numbers were before the smaller units. So obviously we should all know this. And there were two Noahs after two Lamechs, can you imagine? And both of them had floods in their lives. Amazing. Noah actually means man of good omen, as is written in the Old Testament, the Holy Bible. And it's a short form of Defkaliona, of the Greek name, meaning man of good omen. So I've translated this from a Greek article. I hope everybody benefits from this. It's a very good discussion point in that there is no difference between the scientific evidence of Homo and, of course, what the Bible says. God bless you all, and thank you for your support. Please leave your comments. Thank you. Please support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.